Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional, human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumila Mateza. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by calling us on our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights and Recourse. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. On August 16, 2012, the South African police killed 34 striking miners on the Platinum Belt outside Marikana. The workers were striking in support of a demand for 12,500 rand a month. On Sunday, November 20th, Business and Labour met with the Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa and signed the Ekurhuleni Declaration and decided on a 3,500 rand a month as a minimum wage, something around a meager 20 rand an hour. A far cry from the 12,500 rand a month. Today on Rights and Recourse, we explore the national minimum wage agreement coming out of NEDLAC, trying to get answers to some of these questions. But first, let's have a look at this insert.
The national minimum wage, which is a floor below which no worker may be paid, will significantly improve the lives of millions of low-paid workers and begin to address the challenge of wage inequality in our country. At its introduction next year, South Africa will join several countries around the world that have implemented a national minimum wage as an instrument of economic as well as social development. This figure translates to about 3,500 for those who work a 40-hour per week and about 3,900 for those who work a 45-hour week. The social partners have resolved to set the national minimum wage at a level that has meaningful impact on the wages of the lowest paid worker, while minimizing any negative impact on employment.
Well, to discuss today's topic, we are joined by Mr. Leon Lowe, Executive Director of Free Market Foundation, Mr. Joseph Makakeni, President of the National Council of Trade Unions, MACTU, and at our Cape Town studios, we are joined by Mr. Neil Coleman, Strategist Coordinator from the Congress of South African Trade Unions. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
I should like to mention we did try and we did invite the members of the panel that wrote the report on the minimum wage, but they didn't see their way clear of coming here. But we'll continue anyway because these are national issues. So the first thing I want to ask you, probably I should start with you, Neil, down in Cape Town. What is the national minimum wage and why is it necessary?
Well, a national minimum wage sets a wage floor below which no worker can fall. And as we've seen in South Africa, if you don't have that protection, what happens, particularly in a society like ours, where we had, the whole apartheid system was used to reproduce a cheap labor system where rightless workers were given no option but to accept poverty wages. We now sit with that legacy where the majority of South African workers still live in poverty, although they work full time. So the national minimum wage is supposed to provide a floor in order to enable workers to have a basic minimum, and above that to be able to organize through their trade unions and through collective bargaining for a more decent wage.
I think Neil mentioned it there because I was concerned, Dr. Makakeni, if we are going to go the national minimum wage way, what happens to collective bargaining?
The national minimum wage, as Neil says, is a floor for all workers who should not be paid less than that. But the national minimum wage agreement, as well as the principles, is that the national minimum wage will not interfere with collective bargaining agreement between the employer and the employees. It can only interfere if your collective agreement are less than the minimum wage, as well as sectoral determination. If there are more, there's a real clause there that you cannot change that, you cannot lower, you cannot take it down. If you do that, it is, we call it unfair labor practice.
I like the way you put it. I like the way you put it. You cannot lower, you cannot take it down. You don't say you cannot lower, you cannot up it.
Yes. If it is lower, a collective agreement, if it is lower, your sectoral determination, it will go up to 3,500.
Is that the case?
That's the case, and yes, there are systems and mechanisms in place to ensure that happens.
Leon, I was very strange. We've come a long way from the master-servant relationship cemented by the Master and Servant Act of 1856, which made it illegal for black workers to even consider themselves as human.
Yes, it defined workers as white people, and then eventually including what we call coloreds and Asians or Indians, but not black people. And so that's obviously a ghastly history that's gone. And hopefully we now can move from a position where black people were oppressed to a position where at least they're employed. And the problem now is that we have 8 or 9 million black people, mainly black people, a few people of other races, who are not employed. So we now have about half of all the workers in South Africa are actually, we have about 1 in 3 people who want to work without a job. Now, to put it very bluntly, to even mention the word minimum wage under those conditions, I think is morally and ethically reprehensible. When what we should be doing is saying that we want at least for those people to be able to get a job. So if we have this minimum wage, the one thing I hope that NACTU and COSATU and others will agree to is a job exemption right for workers who are unemployed, so that they can at least get a job. You know, and everyone knows, the trade unions, the people who wrote that report, they all know, the Treasury, Minister Ramaphosa, who spoke about a minimal impact, the Deputy President, the Cape Town Institute for Development, the Development Research Institute, who says a statistically insignificant impact. Everyone agrees it will cause unemployment. All that's in debate is how much. And if you call another 500,000 or another 1 million unemployed people statistically insignificant, it reflects, I think, a morally reprehensible position. So if you are ethical and you're concerned about South Africa's victims of apartheid, the first thing you want is a job. And the choice is not between a high wage and a low wage. The choice is between a low wage and no wage. And what this does, it condemns people to no wage, which is much worse.
Let me go back to Cape Town. Neil, apparently, no, not apparently, the panel did brief the partners at NADLAC. How do they get to 3,500 Rand a month?
Well, if you read the panel's report, what they did was they looked at the South African labour market and they looked at the current structure of wages and employment in the different sectors. And they also looked at indicators like the minimum living level, ratios of the minimum to the average or the minimum to the median wage, and other factors as well. And taking all the research into account, they concluded that the 20 Rand an hour or the 3.5 for 40 hours or 3.9 for 45 hours was an appropriate level to introduce the national minimum wage at. Of course, you know, many in organized labor, and if you look at social media, a lot of people are outraged saying, but 20 Rand is a total insult. How do you expect people to work for an hour and only receive 20 Rand? And they are right. It is outrageously low, but I think what it does is it reflects the extreme level of low wage poverty in this country, and the graphic that you're showing currently demonstrates that very well. So what the Deputy President has said and what the panel has said is that there are millions of workers, probably by next year when the national minimum wage is introduced in May, about 4 million formal sector workers will fall under that 20 Rand an hour. So while it is a very low figure, it's a figure which will improve the conditions of living of those workers. And we mustn't forget that those 4 million workers or 5 million workers support up to 4 dependents. They are the people who are supporting the unemployed. And so their wages have to stretch to assist in supporting the unemployed. And this is something that Leon consistently forgets. The other point that Leon doesn't mention is that the wages of low-paid workers have stagnated over the last 20 years. The only wages that have gone up in real terms are the wages of semi-skilled and skilled workers. Despite the wages of low-paid workers having fallen, there's been no creation of employment for those workers. In fact, there's been a loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. So the idea that lowering the wages of workers will create jobs is simply not borne out either in South Africa or in the international experience.
A question I should have probably asked quite early in this discussion, Neil, was for all the years that I know trade unions have been doing, probably Dr. Matlageni, you'd want to come in there, they've been talking about a living wage. Now we're talking about a minimum wage. What is the difference between the two?
Is that to me?
Now, both of you, any of you can take it, Neil, and Mr. Matlageni will come in later.
No. You know, I think what needs to be understood is that we are actually pushing for both. As we said, the national minimum wage is a wage floor, and the role of unions is to organize and to bargain collectively in the different sectors, and to try and ensure that they move progressively towards a living wage. And the experience internationally is that the national minimum wage has assisted unions in improving conditions. And we must remember, unions bargain not only for improved wages, they also bargain for improved conditions, retirement funds, health and safety, all these issues, whereas the national minimum wage only deals with one issue, that's the wage. So a living wage will try to achieve an income which a family can really live on, can get all their basic necessities, whereas the national minimum wage, as the Deputy President said, is not a living wage. And you can't, anybody who understands the cost of living in South Africa cannot argue that 3,500 or even 3,900 is sufficient to provide the basic healthcare, education, food, nutrition, clothing, rent, etc. for a family of 4 or 5 people. It's just not possible. So a living wage is what we're really striving for, but a national minimum wage is a step in that direction.
Dr. Matlageni, I know you want to, I'll also answer it with this one too. When one thinks about the 12,500 Rand AMCU were asking for in the Marikana Platinum and Belts, 3,500 Rand, 20 Rand an hour, is a far cry from that, what they were calling for. Is this an entry level, this 3,500 Rand?
Yes, let me address the 12,000 Rand that AMCU in the mining sector want as the minimum. We have got various sectors, including your chemicals, your mining, your manufacturing, quite a number of them. They have got minimums that they aspire to get in their negotiation with the employers, right? That still stand and will not be disturbed because it is above the national minimum wage. Those are the agreement. We are therefore saying, if you look at the level of unions, workers belonging to the union in South Africa, they are less than 30%. As such, if collective bargaining, if workers belonging to unions and collective bargaining determining the minimums, it will be far more because those will be collective agreement. Coming to the AMCU minimum, as you raised it, AMCU as an affiliate of NAGD, we still stand by them because that's the minimum wage that they need in the mining sector, looking at the wages of the miners in the mining sector for all the years, let alone your working condition. Still relevant, and those are the discussions between the unions in that particular sector, and we support AMCU and other unions. Something that has been left out, Mr. Mateza, is that we are only concentrating on the national minimum wage. In the agreement, there is an accord signed as well, which addresses the situation in Marikana. In the signed accord, it says it bans the use of live ammunition by the public order policing unit, as well as security companies, and also committed them to refrain from acting in a manner that can escalate conflict.
Let's hold it there.
Yes.
If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, please call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tell you to tweet us at Recourse. You can send us an email and tell us whether we are on the right track when we discuss this topic, so that next time when we discuss it again, we can be on the right track. Please stay with us.
Police found powerful military explosives when they swooped on a house in Springs on the Gauteng.
Some of the weapons seized at this house included rocket-propelled grenades, rifles, and even rounds of ammunition.
All military explosives that we found that we cannot obtain a commission.
The weapons found at the house not only had the potential to cause major damage to property, but they also put many lives at risk.
I could have lost any one of my family members, or most of my family members.
Welcome back to Recourse as we discuss the national minimum wage. I want to go back to Cape Town to Neil. Neil, you speak so eloquently about the national minimum wage, and I'm actually surprised if the national minimum has the kind of advantages that are being spoken about. Why is COSATU reluctant to sign this agreement?
You know, I think one thing that we need to understand is that this national minimum wage is the brainchild and the product of COSATU, but also organized labor. So there's no ways that organized labor will walk away from this national minimum wage. We've won some very important advances. Only a year ago, or less than a year ago, business was only prepared to consider a national minimum wage of about 12 Rand an hour, or 2,000 Rand a month, and that was their position for 18 months. They were also not wanting there to be enforcement of that national minimum wage immediately. They were not wanting there to be guaranteed increases. So there have been a whole lot of advances. All those issues have been dealt with. But at the same time, there are a number of issues which we have concerns about. I think anybody who's been in negotiations knows that at the 11th hour, this was the case in the constitutional negotiations in 1995, I remember, but in many, many negotiations, at the 11th hour, you have new ideas, new formulations and proposals. And this was definitely the case in these negotiations, so that the package that finally emerged was a package that had all types of nuances and details which still needed to be considered. And the view of the COSATU leadership was that on an issue as important as this, which has such major ramifications for millions of workers in the country, it was important to go back and get a mandate, but also to ensure, to satisfy ourselves, that what is contained in the agreement will in fact have its intended effect. For example, if I can give you one example.
Neil, my apologies. Do you mean COSATU has been negotiating without a mandate all this time?
No, there's been a mandate, but it's been a dynamic process. You must remember, for example, that the panel of experts was only appointed by the Deputy President towards the end of last year. We only received their report in November last year, and then the Committee of Principals, the leadership structure, met in December, and new proposals were brought to the table. So it's a dynamic and fluid process where you have to constantly get mandates. So what emerged out of the final days of negotiations, as the NACTU president will tell you, was a whole lot of formulations and proposals which put together actually constituted a new package. So, I think that, the example I was going to give you was, if you read the city press today, the business representative interprets a clause in the agreement as saying that there are no guaranteed increases from 2018 when the national minimum wage is introduced. The National Minimum Wage Commission, according to them, will not have to increase the national minimum wage at all if they don't want to. Yet the agreement and our reading of it is that there must be an annual increase which at least maintains the value of the national minimum wage, which means that it must increase at least by the level of inflation. Now, the fact that there's a difference of interpretation on such a major issue at this point indicates that there may be a problem in the wording in the agreement. And there are other areas that I could go into around issues of working hours, the medium-term target, etc., other important issues which need to be addressed. So we don't find down the line, when we get into negotiating the legislation, the implementation, etc., that then the social partners come with completely different expectations and interpretations of the agreement.
Dr. Makagedi, I want to come to on this very issue. What made NACTU sign? What did NACTU introduce a sign which they didn't see all these obstacles? I understand what way he's coming from. One of he talks about working hours, because employers can shorten the working hours and say, because I have to pay you 20 rand an hour, you're going to work 3 hours.
You see, well, NACTU has signed on the dotted line because we believe the principles as agreed are in place in the agreement. For example, there's a commission that will consist of labor, business, community, and the experts. That must look at the working hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and 6 hours that was proposed by labor. That must come up before the implementation of the agreement. So it's part of that. In our view, if you look at the commission, and the commission, you give it power so that it can look at increasing annual increases. That's why we talk of annual increases. And in our view, that commission is very important. It must do its work so that it look at the principles as we agreed. It should not look only the way other people interpret them. So in our view, that's the mandate that we have. And even yesterday, the NACTU Central Committee endorsed these because we'll be part and parcel of the panel to ensure that we look at the loopholes in the process of doing that. And there's a review of even this in 2 years, and in that 2 years we believe we would have looked at issues. If you look, Mateza, even at the Labor Relations Act in 1995, 1996, we negotiated through the night. But there were years that we came and then we said we review. That's why part of the accord, we are even reviewing the Labor Relations Act coming back from 1996. As such, you can't have it all at the same time, but as we move, we'll have a structure that if workers say that there's a deviation from what is agreed in our own interpretation, we are there to ensure that we correct that situation.
Leon, I don't know. I'm trying to get my head around, I think Neil did speak about it earlier, and I'm trying to get my head, will I be right in economic terms if I explain the minimum wage by using this analogy? If the price of bread, for instance, has been set at 1 rand, it can be sold at a lower price but not at a higher price than 1 rand. Is this what it means?
Yes, if the bread price, which would normally be a minimum price, in other words, you can't, a maximum price, you can't sell it for more. And this is saying that you may not employ for less. This is a minimum, bread price would be a maximum. And so yes, the answer is if you set a maximum, then what you do is you cause a shortage. If you set a minimum, what you do is you cause a surplus. Now that's not debatable, everyone knows that. And the interesting thing is, Neil said 3,500 is not a reasonable wage. He's right. Why are they so mean? Why are they so cruel? Why do they want to pay people only 20 rand an hour? Why not 100? Why not 1 million rand a month. I mean, we could have a nation of millionaires. Why don't they want a million?
There was a guy who phoned some radio station during the week and said, I think the president must give everybody 2 million rand.
Yes. Why not have a nation of millionaires? You just set the minimum wage at $1 million a month. It's really simple. Now, because everybody knows that it causes unemployment. So those studies that were done in what he called various factors, interesting term, which means it's too complicated to actually make any realistic prediction. What they do is they set the minimum wage so low that the number of people who are thrown into misery and destitution, in workers as well as small business employers, is so small that nobody minds adding them to the already 8 million people who are destitute and don't have a job. So what you do is you increase it to 11 million. And then people just don't worry about that. Now, you cannot debate the fact that if you raise, as the panel knows, we gave evidence to the panel and they agreed, that if you raise the minimum wage, you cause unemployment. All they set about to do was to raise it by so little that it doesn't make what Neil calls a decent wage or a living wage. But what it does do, it conceals the unemployment it creates. That's what it does. It hides the fact that it actually causes misery at the margin. Now, big business, by the way, would sign this accord for a very obvious reason. Very simple. Firstly, they delay so they have time to replace workers with technology, and they're doing that. In the series Farmers, I've seen them buying washing and sorting and packing machines and laying off thousands and thousands of workers. Very simple, not difficult. Big business responds simply by replacing workers with machines. It also responds by going overseas, and it responds by simply not expanding, not investing. Small business, on the other hand, can't do that. It goes out of business or never starts. The unemployed have no recourse at all. This is rights and recourse. They have no rights and no recourse. And what they do is they just are plunged into deeper destitution and misery. And if they thought it was difficult to get a job before the minimum wage, they should know that after the minimum wage, they might as well, resort to crime. What actually happens is the South African Labour and Development Institute, also at UCT, made the point that the minimum wage is mirrored in the informal sector. What happens is that people just go from the formal sector to the informal sector, which is a nice word for the illegal sector, the criminal sector. We call it the informal sector, but it's actually people who are operating unlawfully. And so what happens is we drive people into this shadow economy, this underground economy where they have no protection, they have no unions. And what I would like you to do is to realize that if you can get 9 million unemployed people employed, your membership will double. It's in the interests of COSATU to actually have these people with jobs, and here it's proposing a measure that will reduce its own membership.
You want to say something, but I want to go back to Ghana. I want to go to Neil. Neil, one of the beliefs is that the labor market will absorb more workers. And for the sake of me, I don't understand how can a minimum wage actually increase employment?
So Dumila, the first point is that Leon's theory simply doesn't apply in the real world, because people are not loaves of bread. People produce. People live in families, they come to work, and society changes based on what people are being paid, how much they produce, etc., etc. And every economy in the world has shown, when the national minimum wage has been introduced and it's been increased, is that the effects are dynamic and complex. They're not mechanical like with a loaf of bread, that if you raise the price, the demand for it goes down. And the simple reason for that is because you have a whole lot of variables. One of the variables is that people demand more products because they now have more money in their pocket, they can consume, and the poor particularly and workers aren't able to save because they have so little disposable income. So you have a huge boost to demand in the economy. That's the first point. The second point is that it leads to far greater productivity by workers. There's less frustration because they are getting paid such low wages. And there are a whole series of dynamic factors which come into the equation. So the real world simply doesn't work in the way that Leon has described it. And in fact, what we've seen in Germany last year, in Brazil over the last 20 years, and in a number of other countries, is that with rising minimum wages, it's possible to have rising employment. But in order to do that, you have to accompany or complement the rising national minimum wage with appropriate industrial policies which ensure that there's development of industry, employment of more people. But the rising domestic demand does help to lay the basis for those policies to become more effective. But the approach of driving wages down, as we've seen with the apartheid cheap labor system, which Leon seems to love so much, that approach of driving wages down has not succeeded in creating jobs. In fact, it's done the opposite.
Well, guys, let's go to a break. When we come back, I know Dr. Matkatuga, you wanted to say something. If you'd like to call us, you can call us on our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or you can tweet us at Right Recourse. Okay, you can send us an email and talk to us about what we are talking about today and other issues you want us to talk about on this show. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Rights and Recourses to discuss the national minimum wage here on Rights and Recourse. Dr. Makakeni, you wanted to weigh in on something Leon said earlier.
Yes, indeed. When you have got the national minimum wage, that principle, a number of countries in the world have gone that route. The intention is to ensure that you minimize or you take out the underemployment, right? You're also taking out those minimums that cannot be regulated at a lower level. As such, if you leave it there, you say when workers want work, whether you are paid less than the minimum wage, you are saying you are always at work, but you are a poor working person.
But Leon pointed out to something that they can go outside of the country. We have seen presently in South Africa at a level of waitrons at restaurants. You find no South African. There's no South African who work in that space.
That's exactly the intention why we're introducing the minimum wage. The intention is to ensure that you increase your income level, you increase your consumption, you increase your productivity, you motivate your workforce. The intention, therefore, will even increase the economy of the country. We don't agree with the notion that when apartheid was here, our people were paid peanuts. We want to improve that situation. We take out our people out of that level. We don't buy the synopsis that as long as you work, like in the past when people were not earning any, but they called them, you are paid in kind. So you become less and less.
You
get millimeal, you get a job.
And a dope.
Yes, and a dope. You remember those days? So we want to take our people out of there. As such, you minimize, you ensure that your minimum, you control your minimum. That's the way. So we don't agree, with Leon. We have not agreed even in the past on this aspect.
Gentlemen, let's take this call from Antonio from Cape Town. Antonio, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hi, good afternoon. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Antonio. Can hear you.
Yes, I'm speaking about I would like to just fall in with the minimum wage. I think it's a good idea that there is a minimum wage that people can go home with, but I think it's going to be to the detrimental of lots of people because there's going to be a lot of unemployment. Now, I'm a contractor and I work for many, many food companies, and I could name them, you know, like Peninsula Beverages and Tiger Brands, and so we go on and on and on. And they use, you know, people like that, they use labor brokers to bring in labor to work. And obviously, if they're going to get a minimum wage of $3,500 a month, they definitely, those labor brokers are actually going to up that wage and obviously take half of that home themselves. And the people that's getting that will only go home with the $3,500, obviously. But at the end of the day, there'll be thousands and thousands of people who won't have work because companies are definitely going to automate the machines. They're going to definitely take less and less of these people to work at their companies. And the government, as far as I'm concerned, they should put up apprentices schools so they could actually teach these people. I have people that work for me that come to me as laborers. They sweep the street. I give them $200 a day, which is a little, and I feel sorry for them, but I push them to learn to weld, to pipe fit, to do engineering. And believe me, in Cape Town, my name's Antonio Henry, Mario's Pipe Services, and you can go to any pipe fitting company and you'll find that 80% come from me.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Antonio. And Neil, I want to come down to you. Antonio has pointed out of job losses here, and he's not alone because as I was reading this document, I found that no less a body than National Treasury warned that the national minimum wage could lead to job losses amounting to 715,000 rand. Not only that, the GDP will fall by 2.1%.
Yeah, this is one of a number of studies that was done, and basically the panel concluded that the threat of job loss was based not only on South African but also on international studies was negligible, minimal at that level. And the international studies that have been done, and here we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of studies, show that despite these dire predictions which have been made, in a country like Germany they predicted 1 million job losses, that hasn't materialized. In the United States they predicted job losses, that hasn't materialized. Where the national minimum wage is highest in the United States actually is where job creation levels are highest. So a lot of these studies demonstrate that the impact of a national minimum wage and rising wages is negligible, statistically insignificant in all these studies from around the world. So we understand why people like Antonio predict that or have this concern or whatever, but you cannot only look at the micro situation of an individual business. You've got to look at the impact on the entire economy, the dynamic impact. And a study that was commissioned, which the National Minimum Wage Panel took very seriously, looked into these dynamic impacts on the economy as a whole in relation to demand, productivity, GDP growth, etc., and found that the national minimum wage would have a relatively insignificant impact on employment, but that in terms of poverty and inequality, it would dramatically reduce poverty and inequality, and would also, over the long term, increase growth. And there are very logical reasons why that is the case, for reasons that we discussed earlier, around growing economic activity, about bringing people into the economic mainstream. When over half your workers are actually living from hand to mouth and are not even able to consume the basics to feed their families, to clothe their families, etc., what you're doing is you're stagnating the economy and you're going for a race to the bottom. So this is a different economic model, and I think that many people will be pleasantly surprised that the experience in South Africa will be similar to the experiences in other countries around the world, that the national minimum wage can actually act as a stimulus for economic development.
gentlemen, the two of you here, probably you can help me here. I seem to be, I believe, are we not putting the cart before the horses? In its report, the National Treasury points out that there is an argument that any big policy intervention should ideally take place when the economy of the country is strong or growing, at least growing. Our economy is not growing.
Yes, this is absolutely right. And Neil thinks that somehow if you take money from one person and give it to another person, the word he used was you boost the economy. Well, that's obviously nonsense. All you do is you make one person better off and one person worse off. And he also says people are not loaves. Well, of course they aren't. He thinks they are. He thinks it doesn't matter if you throw them into unemployment. If loaves don't get sold, it doesn't matter. This is a human cost. And these studies so-called around the world, firstly the countries that have had a minimum wage without this impact, you're absolutely right, are the ones that have had strong economies, full employment and high growth. Or at least not anything like our level of unemployment, which is the highest level of sustained unemployment in the world. So the real world is that people buy less of something if it costs more. This is the real world. The real world is that you buy less labor if it costs more. It's got nothing to do with whether labor are human beings. The tragedy is that labor is human beings. If you raise the price, if you have a minimum price of eggs or bread or houses or something, it doesn't really matter because there isn't a human cost. This is where the problem arises here. Worldwide, the studies are very simple worldwide. The studies show that
you're going to come in,
where you have minimum wages, you do in fact have...
Well, I mean, you know, Leon's just repeating the same, he's repeating the same mantra, and he's not responding to the point that we raised earlier, which is that wages of the low paid have stagnated and dropped in South Africa, yet employment hasn't been created.
Yes,
how does he explain that? If labour is just a commodity like other commodities, it's become cheaper, why haven't more low paid workers been employed?
You know, if we talk about, let's talk about apartheid. The White Mine Workers Union in the 1970s and 80s said that job reservation wasn't protecting them adequately and they wanted a minimum wage. Because in their view, the minimum wage would protect white workers with jobs from black workers without.
What led to the 1922 strike?
No, it was long after that, in the 1970s and 80s. And Jannie Beetke, the then secretary of the Mine Workers Union, was famous for saying that what white workers needed to protect them from black workers was a minimum wage. And this is exactly the consequence it will have. So what you want to do is and Neil, talk of responding, hasn't responded to why not R1 million a month. And the answer is because you then are forced to admit that the impact of a minimum wage is to throw people out of work. And all you will do by lowering the level at which you put the minimum wage is by making the inhumanity less conspicuous.
I wanted to come to you, Dr. McClegany. I just want to take this call from Victor from Johannesburg. Victor, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for hosting me. I have a few points that I'd like to make. The first one is that we all talk about this, but we must go back to basics. We need in our country to look at birth control, and we need to look at how men look after their women and their children. We have a serious crisis because we are breeding too many people. Our kids are not fed properly. Our kids are not educated properly. And now we sit with too many people. Our productivity of people is low. All of our entrepreneurs have left our country. There are not enough jobs to go around. I sit and watch these young school leavers knock on my door daily. And they are so dejected and downtrodden because they walk from door to door trying to find work. And they can't find it. And it's because there are too many of them and there's not enough work. To raise the minimum rate is an idealistic thing, and it would be good. But it will also damage, because if you give somebody more money, somebody's got to pay for it. So the price of bread will go up. If you pay somebody more, everything goes up. The price of fuel will go up, price of bread will go up, and then you'll have to give the minimum guy more money so that he can pay for everything else. So I think everybody is wasting time. We waste too much time on these things. We must go back to basics. We must look after our children. We must educate them properly. Men especially must look after their women and their children.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sorry, my apologies for calling you Victor. It sounded like Victor. The thing that again I wanted to come to, does the report not address productivity?
The report...
I don't hear this word.
Yes, the report does address productivity. That's why the report says, if we go this route, those more than 47% working people in this country who earn less than 3,500, if you give them incentive is a minimum wage, who are earning far less. We're saying those workers, therefore, will come to the level of motivation, will come to the level of training, which we are not doing more. Therefore, one thing that Leon is not addressing, I mean, I heard Neil is talking to it. South Africa has the highest level in the world of inequality, the highest level at that bracket as well of poverty. This is part and parcel of addressing that phenomenon. And if you don't address it head on now, when the economy is not growing, because there are many dynamics throughout the world in the economy that will contribute to that. We agree that the minimum wage alone are not a magic bullet. Not alone.
You need panacea, as the president
you need a lot of contribution towards that. But what we are against, that's why we signed on the dotted line, is that those underpaid, underemployed, those that will increase the level of unemployment and poverty, to which it is a time bomb in our view. If those workers, those communities come up, all of us, even sitting in this studio, anything can happen. That is addressing it now. And we're saying why we reach 3,500. The research is very clear. It says over 47% of working people here earn less than that. It is a step in the right direction in our view to address this, all of us. There will be, after 2 years, within 2 years for that matter, the Commission will be looking at a number of factors, including international benchmarks, to say what has been the impact, what can we do better than leaving it back until there's a crisis in this country.
Neil, I think we are back in 1902 after the Anglo-Boer War. Or probably let's take it to 1948 when the National Party came into power, and they decided in order to deal with the poor white problem, let us use state institutions and employ our people, get our people employed. Why are we not doing the same thing? It's state-owned enterprises.
Well, exactly. I think, the problem with that was that it was done to benefit one racial group and to discriminate against another. So raising minimum wages for everybody is very different to what Leon was saying about raising minimum wages for a white labor aristocracy. And the point that you're raising about using state-owned enterprises, using the state levers to improve the lives of ordinary people is absolutely basic to any developmental government. You cannot have a developmental economic policy unless you use the levers of state. And even with the national minimum wage, we've said that the areas like you mentioned, the issue of incentives or assistance that the state gives to small business around access to credit, etc., the quid pro quo must be that those businesses act as responsible corporate citizens, if you like, pay their workers decently, observe labor laws, etc. But this is not just a question of morality. It's about unleashing the economic and human potential of society. If you have over half of your population suppressed and unable to participate, that's going to have massive economic dampener effects. And actually the history is not that minimum wages have only been introduced in countries that are growing economically. In Brazil, in the early 2000s, Brazil was in the economic doldrums, and they adopted a deliberate policy of raising the national minimum wage, of extending social security, of extending industrial programs, of active lending policies, and that had a massively beneficial impact, with over 17 million jobs created in a space of 10 years. So I think that the point that you're raising is absolutely correct. It relates to what are the complementary policies that government needs to put in place. As the NACTU president has said, the national minimum wage by itself is not a silver bullet, but combined with other policies, a new wage policy can be very powerful in helping to transform the current trajectory of our economy.
Let's take this call from Manx in Durban. Manx, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon. Thanks for hearing me, taking my call. I don't want to get into the debate of minimum wage, but I think one of the contributory factors which could be addressed is the excessive profits by big companies and the exploitation of middle people in the labour market. And I disagree that there is a moral obligation on all employers that to pay a little bit more than the minimum wage of 20 Rand an hour. So, I mean, that's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Manx. Leon, that refers to you. I think you can answer that better than all of us. And I was surprised to pick up in the newspapers this weekend that a very well-known former Springbok player only pays his people 8 Rand a day.
Yes, let's be very clear. If you're a normal human being, unless you're mentally ill or perverted, you want people to earn more. That's not in debate here. There's no debate about whether...
Do you agree with Manx that there's a moral obligation that people can pay more than the 20 Rand? They're not being stopped to pay more than the 20 Rand an hour.
There's no restriction on what people should do as decent human beings. This is not about whether we are decent human beings who want people to earn a decent living. We all want that. I would like everybody to be a millionaire. We have not yet heard why the minimum wage isn't $1 million a month, because then you have to admit the inhumanity and cruelty of it to the people you throw out of work. Let me deal with inequality. You accuse me of not dealing with inequality.
Yes.
The best way the most dramatic way to reduce inequality is to employ 8 million unemployed people. That is the currently biggest single cause of unemployment, is that they don't have a job. So what you will do with the minimum wage is get more people earning zero and thereby increasing inequality. So the difference between the people who have a job and the people who don't have a job is the problem. If we go to Max and concerned about the people making money and profits.
Huge profits.
Yes. There's a simple way to deal with that, which is called competition. And this, by the way, is what Brazil did. Brazil liberalized the economy when they introduced the minimum wage, and so they had economic growth. They were a spectacular example. But also, whenever you hear someone refer to one country, be careful, because you're ignoring the rest of the world. The world as a whole does not do this when you have high levels of unemployment. This would be considered by pretty much every economist in the world as a crazy thing to do under our conditions.
Gentlemen, the other thing, Neil and Mr. Makageni, apparently there's going to be another commission set, I like this word, the Decent Wage Commission.
Which we all want.
And what's going to happen to the other 2 commissions that are in this sphere, the Employment Equity Act and the Employment Conditions Commissions? Are we adding another bureaucratic institution?
Okay, should I?
No, go ahead.
Okay. You see, in our view as Labour, this commission will deal specifically with the national minimum wage, will actually deal with issues related to the minimum wage, will deal with the benchmarks internally and internationally, specifically on this issue. That is the intention. To ensure that if there are exemptions, are those exemptions following the agreed principles? If there are any exclusion, those exclusions, are they in line? That is the intention. And also that commission will look at these annual increases or annual adjustment every year to come up to the committee of the principals to ensure that they put up as proposals. That is the intention. It's not killing the others, it has got. specific terms that are coming up anytime.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we ran out of time. Neil, thank you very much. We'll call on you again once we are discussing this issue further, especially when the panel is here. I would like to point out that some of the graphics you saw there are courtesy of Neil Coleman, who sent them to us. Neil, thank you very much for some of those graphics. John Spiropoulos of the University of Cape Town suggests that the proposed national minimum wage panders to markets rather than addressing the shame of impoverishment and exclusion. If not, what do you make of the Deputy President's quick comment of appeasing ratings agencies than addressing the fundamental issues of poverty and inequality through inclusive growth? The views expressed on the show are not necessarily those of the SABC or Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 5 on Wednesday morning. You can also find us on YouTube. From me and the rest of the crew, goodbye.